right, so to try to figure out Quentin Meillassoux, I think it might help us to have a little bit more in the background. So, as you recall from our first lecture in the class, very back on the first day, we talked a little bit about the ways that these theoretical texts will overlap with and intersect with a variety of other schools of thought. This means I often find myself explaining a theory based on the school of thought that it intersects with. I think that could be helpful for understanding what Meillassoux is doing in this text. Meillassoux is a contemporary French philosopher, and he works in a school called speculative realism, sometimes also called object-oriented ontology. Speculative realism is inheriting an entire body of Enlightenment-era philosophy. One of the major figures of Enlightenment philosophy is someone like René Descartes, who you may have heard of before as the whipping boy of a lot of contemporary philosophers. Descartes' whole aim, his whole idea, is to think about how can we approach the world and derive any kind of certainty from it? How can I really know what I'm encountering? And how could I think about the world without doubting what I'm thinking about? He restricts things to what may only be seen as clear and distinct ideas. If I don't have a clear or distinct idea about something, I can't really philosophize about it. Now, you'll readily see that not a whole lot of ideas that we find are very clear or very distinct. The rest of modern philosophy is kind of trying to figure out how can we come to clarity? How can we make distinctions between things? This is why, as I've said in the past, modernity is so invested in things like taxonomies, categorization. How do we make distinctions between things? And how can we know what these things are? Well, the obvious first answer from that is we know what things are because we perceive them, we come across them, we touch them, we see them, we smell them, we know that they're there because of our sensory perception of them. So another major name in Enlightenment philosophy is Immanuel Kant. Kant is going to try to think about what can we properly say that we have knowledge of. I can feel things, I can have opinions about stuff, but when I know something, I'm thinking about a different way of understanding it. What can I possibly know, especially given the fact that the only way I can perceive the world is through my sensory perceptions? So Kant is going to make a distinction between the thing itself that I am perceiving and what he calls a concept of the thing that I build in my mind. So let's say I am looking at a squirrel running up a tree or something like that. How can I say I have knowledge of that thing? Well, what I do is I see the thing, and then my eyeballs send stimulus to my brain in a series of synapses, and that synapse then interprets itself in my head as, oh, that's a tree. So when I say I know the tree is there, or I have knowledge of the tree, what I really have knowledge of is not the thing itself, is not the tree that is out in my backyard, is not that thing. What I have knowledge of, what I can properly say that I know, is the concept of the tree that I've created in my head. So what happens to that tree out there? Is there still a tree out there? Of course there's a tree out there. But I can't know anything about the tree. So what does this do? What about the real world? How can we know anything about the real world? Well, Kant says what we do with the real world is not called knowledge. What we do with the real world is called speculate. I can't know what the real world is, but I can have speculation about it because I have no way of knowing it without those sensory perceptory filters in order to get at it. I know concepts, but I can speculate about things that I have no sensory perception of. Speculative realism, then, wants to talk about those things that we speculate about, the thing itself, those real-world objects as they appear apart from my concepts. Remember postmodernity. Postmodernity reminded us that all of these nice, tidy constructions that we find in modernity and Enlightenment are themselves just constructions. Speculative realism would ask us to consider the possibility that that real thing out there, which Kant says we have no access to, may be no less impossible to talk about than the concept that we've built of it in our own heads. Why then can't we talk about these speculative things as though they may become real? That gives us some background of the world that Meillassoux is addressing and the way that he's working through things. Now let's think about maybe a couple of ways that we can apply this text. On the one hand, it'll help to understand the surface of what he's talking about, just a direct idea that he's engaging, but then maybe also to expand that a bit more, and then we'll apply it to Boneyard as well. So first of all, just for the surface content, ultimately what Meillassoux is addressing here is the problem of evil. This is a classic problem in philosophy of religion, thinking about the goodness of God and the power of God is fundamentally at odds with one another. You can't have a God that is both ultimately all-powerful and one that wants good when you have evil in the world. Either God doesn't want good, or God is not powerful enough to stop the bad things that are happening. This is a major issue in the history of philosophy of religion. It's been addressed by apologetics, it's been addressed by religious philosophers, it's been addressed by non-religious philosophers. What Meillassoux wants to do is maybe a little bit different. He wants to think about not just the problem of evil in this very broad, abstract sense, but something far more affective, something far more personal. He wants to think about looking for justice for the dead, and a very specific kind of dead, for those who have died unjustly or undeservingly. He wants to think about the death of children, or the death of parents, or mass death, things that hang on us, things that cause a kind of trauma. We might think about this in relation to what was going on with Kathy Caruth last week, when we talked about trauma as a shared event, a thing that we all encounter, that we all have to live through. Well, this is one traumatic event. We can think about this directly in the context of Boneyard. Beachy's text, or Jake's text, is really a response to the dramatic encounter of his mother's death. What do you do with that event that I can no longer make sense of? This is the very question that Meillassoux wants to address as well. What do we do with what he calls the essential specter? The specter for which there can be no mourning, or for whom mourning is not a release or a reconciliation. There is no getting over this thing, and it haunts us, it stays with us, this death that we can't get past, this traumatic event that continues to impact us, that continues to influence us. What an essential specter requires, Meillassoux says, is not a typical kind of mourning, is not simply neglect, but rather he calls it essential mourning, an essential mourning. Essential mourning, he says, is a way of mourning the dead that acknowledges and recognizes their death, while maintaining what Meillassoux thinks of as a right relation to the dead. That is, thinking of the dead with some sort of hope, or thinking of the dead with some sort of non-morbid relation. Now, as a religious person, you might be saying, well, that's easy. Dead people go to heaven. Problem solved. One day I'll go to heaven too, and then that reconciliation will finally happen. This is essential mourning. However, Meillassoux is going to say absolutely not. In fact, our normal modes of understanding death are insufficient, he says, to bring about essential mourning. And he gives a good reason for it. If by immortality or heaven or eternity you mean floating away from your body and living up in a cloud forever and ever and ever with God, that's not a proper idea of living with the dead, says Meillassoux. And if I must hope to one day be there as well for that kind of reconciliation, he says, this is not the way of achieving essential mourning, that essential mourning that he wants to get after. Part of this is because that old problem of evil. Look, if God is all-powerful, he's going to have some answer for this problem of unjust death. This makes that traditional religious response not simply unsatisfying, which many would say that it is. It makes us live our lives as though we were already dead. The only hope I might have is to die one day also. That's the hope for reconciliation. It's much more than that. The problem of evil is going to claim that God himself is unjust for allowing such deaths to happen. Now, if our response as religious people is to say, well, God will make it all better one day, that actually makes things worse, Meillassoux says, because now not only is God unjust for making people die unjustly or being responsible or complicit with their unjust deaths, now he's going to make me love him for it. And that is not a way of actualizing essential mourning. That is not a way of helping us cope with or overcome our trauma. The other option, of course, he says, is to not believe in God. So if one option for coping with trauma or coping with the dead is thinking about God giving us an afterlife, he says, well, the other option seems like an obvious one. Don't believe in God. Well, that's got a problem too, actually. And if I don't believe in God, then what he's saying is all of these unjust deaths are ultimately meaningless when it comes down to it. And he says, I may hope for myself to have annihilation when I'm dead. That's all well and good. But I can't, in good conscience, hope for the annihilation of another person. If I'm trying to find a solution for unjust death, annihilation simply doesn't cut it. So we're stuck. We can't really go anywhere. Either I believe in God or I'm an atheist. But I can't really have either one of those. If I believe in God, then I don't have a response to the essential specter. And if I'm an atheist, I don't have a response to the essential specter. This is what creates the essential dilemma, the spectral dilemma. The primary systems in the atheistic and religious binary are insufficient to account for the essential specters or fulfill the requirements of essential morals. So what do I do? Meillassoux gives us a possible solution. He says the solution to the dilemma is to reconsider the binary of atheism versus religious. Each position still offers us something, even something necessary for figuring out how to reach this essential level for mourning. On the one hand, the religious perspective is going to give us a solution to the problem of death in the form of some sort of afterlife, in the form of some sort of rebirth. On the other hand, the atheistic viewpoint is going to give us an emphasis on justice for the dead that's not being reached in that religious framework. So what Meillassoux wants to do then is think about these two contradictory systems, this binary, as not necessarily being something that must be opposed, but rather needs to be sublated into a larger system. So in a sense here, what Meillassoux is doing is kind of Hegelian. He's looking at two things in conflict and saying the conflict is not in those things themselves, rather the conflict is in the framework we're using to approach those things. So he says if we start from the solution, we may find a way to work our way backward and figure out an argument to build ourselves up to how to get to essential mourning. And to do that, he gives us a really weird idea. It comes down to rethinking what it means when we say something like, God exists, and we talk about the existence of God. His solution is to possibly call divine inexistence. Now that sounds on the surface atheistic, but it's really not. What he's saying is not that God can't exist. What atheists usually mean when they talk about the existence of God is that the sort of thing that we talk about when we talk about God is impossible. There is no way that that being could possibly exist. On the other hand, religious people, when they talk about God as the necessary being, the being without whom no other thing could possibly be. God has to be first, he has to be present, he has to be present at all times. Meillassoux is saying, well, what if there's something different? What if instead we think of a God who does not yet exist, or a God who is going to exist later, a God who could come into existence at some point? There's two major implications from this. One of them is that we're going to have to rethink what we mean by God on this definition. If God is not a necessary being, well, then what is God? And that also, sort of by analogy, is going to make us rethink what we mean by necessity in general, because if we need God in order for all the things to be, then nothing can be without God. That's the standard definition of what God is and what it means to be a necessary being. The other thing that we get from this is that God can't be blamed for all those horrific deaths that have happened in the past. All these essential specters that are floating around. We can't look to God and say, well, you should have done something about this, because he wasn't there. That God doesn't yet exist. Which means at some point, if he does exist, then he's not going to be blamed for all these horrible things that have happened in the past. And that atheistic response to the problem of evil becomes null and void. Now, for a long time, apologists and theologians have talked about the necessity of God, the necessary being of God, and they've said this really often repeated line, that if God is not necessary, then nothing is. And that's really kind of the point that Meillassoux is after here. Yeah, nothing is. In fact, this whole idea of necessity, of certainty, of clarity and distinction, this whole ground of the modern philosophical endeavor is a misguided intellectual experience experiment. We should not be interested in chasing down necessity, he says. And we can't think about framing the world as only those things that we can know necessarily with clarity or with distinction. We can't limit ourselves to just keeping in mind a concept. Rather, we should be thinking about not what's necessary, but what's possible. So if there are no necessary natural laws governing all of reality, if under the surface of the things that we view in the world we're not finding some great divine order, what we find then is just utter chaos. It's not that we're sort of tracing this Platonic ladder up to these great forms. Rather, we're finding that on the other side of the appearances of the world, the concepts that we've built, we actually are finding chaos. But there's a kind of hope that Meillassoux finds in this chaos. It's not just chaos for chaos' sake. What we actually discover is in chaos and with no natural laws necessarily governing chaos, literally anything can happen. And on a long enough time scale, when anything can happen, anything will happen. Which means at some point, a God could come into being. Now remember, there's no necessity here. So the atheistic argument that God can't possibly exist doesn't really work. There's no such thing as necessity. And the religious argument that says that God must have always been also doesn't really fit in here. We'd have to think about God as being one that doesn't have necessity. And now in this context, we can have a God who comes to be at some point in the future. So what would this God look like? Well, first of all, he would be free from the blame of death, right? Those deaths happened before he came into being. So he's not responsible. It's not an absence of his power or a lack of his power for not letting or not saving those people. This God would also be non-coercive. He wouldn't have to force us to believe in his justice or his rightness for doing the things that he's done. But most importantly, the most important feature of this God who is to come to be is this. He would have to be able to be a resurrective God, a God that resurrects the dead, or a God that does some sort of justice for the dead. Now, I want to take a little time out from Meillassoux for a second, if I can, just because I feel like it's important that we address the fact that we're in Easter week, for crying out loud. This is a really important moment for the Christian faith, mostly because this is the week that we celebrate not the death of Jesus, but the resurrection of Jesus. Now, resurrection in Christian theology has got a long history, and it emerges out of thinking about the promises that God made to the Jewish people. Look, God said, I will be your God. God said that I will come and reside with you. He made all of these promises to these people, but they were a long time coming. Those promises didn't get fulfilled just immediately or right away. In fact, they took generations to get fulfilled. Well, hey, if God has promised me something and I'm waiting for it to happen and then I die, what about the God who promised me? That means that God is going to have to do something to take care of the dead. In fact, if God is just, the Bible says, death is going to be something that he has to resolve, something that he has to take care of. When we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, this is a deeply important point because it's saying that God has figured out a way to take care of this problem of death. You know, as I'm reading through Meillassoux here, I'm thinking, you're looking for a God who has a resurrective power. You're looking for a God who does not guilt people into loving him. You're looking for a God who's deeply invested in justice. And I sort of feel like, oh, well, you're going to be very pleased to hear about this dude Jesus, who seems to do all of those things. Resurrection is a key point of the Christian faith and a key central part of what we do. But it's not just, I think Meillassoux is right about this. If our hope for reconciliation with the dead has something to do with floating away off to heaven, we've missed the point. And the Easter season is a reminder to us that what we celebrate is not death. What we celebrate is not disembodied spirits floating around with harps and long flowy robes on top of clouds. What we hope for is bodily resurrection, is living inside of a body, inside of this body, that God will do justice by this worm-eaten thing at some point. All right, so let's just keep this one thing in mind. When we talk about essential mourning, what we're looking for is resurrection that brings justice to the dead. Essential mourning is hope for resurrection that will do justice for the dead. Now, if we think about essential mourning as also related to trauma, as we talked about last time, then we might think about how this book wants to resolve this entire thread of trauma, this whole traumatic experience that is worked through, and what Meillassoux, what resurrection, what essential mourning nothing has to do with any of that stuff. Let's look at the text together. I'm on page 296. This is the very end of Boneyard. This is right at the end of the last chapter, the closing paragraphs. And it starts with probably the greatest line in this book. I don't believe you've heard or understood a single word I've said. Yeah, no kidding, Beachy. I don't believe you've heard or understood a single word I've said. I sense disbelief radiating from your barely conscious mind. You think I lie. You're right. I'm not a rock and roll star. I've never had much aptitude for music at all. I can't even play this imaginary guitar. I'm not really a musician. I'm a pirate. Anyway, you've fallen asleep. You're dreaming your own incoherent dreams, solving your own imaginary problems, fleeing non-existent enemies, or pursuing shadows. What sort of games must I play to make you come back? I'll do whatever it takes. You taught me everything I know. Nothing and nobody comes back. We all just keep on drifting farther and farther away. So here it seems that you he's addressing is the source of his trauma, the death of his mother, something along those lines, this you that he keeps calling back, but also saying maybe you've fallen asleep, sort of alluding to the fact that all of this was just a dream to begin with, that we're reading a kind of fever dream narrative. He goes on, but imagine you come back to me after all. Everything wavers for a moment. You pat me on the head, ruffle my hair. You're a good little boy. What about regenerate, you say? Did you find a way to use regenerate? What about dormant? So now here the you has become the teacher. Now it's not Beth. Now it's not the mother. Now it's something else. Now it's the teacher. Remember this teacher that started him on this whole process of writing stories. When he finishes his schoolwork, now he's going to go write. What about regenerate, he says. What about dormant? Which means the you he's addressing here is not just the lost object of desire, but is also that primordial father, is also that ruling entity that makes sense of the entire world, that spurs our actress and spurs our interest. We might say that if modernity is trying to grapple with the death of God, the essential specter that haunts the end of this text is God himself. The one who's put us on this whole thing to begin with, but also the one that at this point in history we feel we've been left to our own devices. We feel we've been abandoned. We feel as though God has left us. He goes on, everybody else is sleeping, except perhaps the guards at the hostel gate, the butch guards, the femme guards. They aren't expecting any escape attempts tonight. Why it's so quiet here. When you are the only one awake, it seems so improbable, all of them sleeping, warm under their blankets, but their toes are cold. Cremation is preferred in these times. The earth is too cold to dig into. The crust is hard as bone. Whether or not I fertilize the earth, I am indifferent, whatever happens to my cremains. On the table, the staff has placed a lily and a vase. Lily of the valley is not my favorite. Its white flowers remind me of Easter eggs. Lily of the valley is the sign of the second coming, the ladder to heaven, Jacob's tears. Elongated like a giraffe, a symbol of purity and humility, it seems a little bit false and conceited to me. When Mary cried at the cross, her tears became this flower. If I cried at a mass grave of all of us, my tears would become a flowering succulent, bitter root. It flourishes in barren clay ground and often regenerates from seemingly dried and dead roots. Deep, pink to nearly white petals, an intestinal explosion from tubular capsules low to the ground. Or scarlet globe mallow, velvety hairy, rounded lobed leaves, flowers brick or red-orange. Like an underground sun, it's the beauty of hellfire and blood oranges. It's a flower not as deep as its coloring, but not overly demanding either. Or a striped coral root, a kind of orchid, actually, which doesn't have any chlorophyll. It isn't green, and has no use for the energy of the sun. Flesh-colored stems, striped flowers of pink and brown, like some fierce and beautiful wildcat from a possible or impossible future. Beneath the surface of the ground, its tangled mass of root-like stems that may lie dormant for one or many seasons, storing the nutrients that come from underground. You can see at the end here, Beachy has switched from a metaphor of sleep to a metaphor of death, but the way he wants to think about death is through all of these descriptions of flowers. If I cried at the mass grave of all of us, the shared trauma that we exist in now, the first flower he imagines is bitterroot, this flowering succulent. The way he describes it is like this, though. It often regenerates from seemingly dried and dead roots, things going up to heaven when they die, pink to nearly white petals, intestinal explosion from tubular capsules low to the ground, something erupting out of a grave. But the second image he gives us is the globe mallow, velvety, hairy, rounded lobed leaves, brick or orange red like an underground sun, so not coming out from underground. The beauty of hellfire. So on the one hand, we have a flower that symbolizes heaven, and now on the other hand, a flower that symbolizes hell. These two poles of the afterlife imagined in Christian imagination. But he doesn't stop there either. Now he goes on to talk about the striped coral root, with no chlorophyll in it. It has no use for the energy of the sun. Beneath the surface of the ground is a tangled mass of root-like stems that may lay dormant for one or many seasons. This is simply death, simply annihilation. So we have three different ways of seeing death. We have two that collapse neatly into the religious or the Christian worldview, heaven and hell. On the other hand, we have this atheistic response. This is matching up really closely with what Meillassoux gives us. We can have either this escape into an afterlife, or we have this refusal to accept escape, and neither one of those things is ultimately satisfying for us. But this is where we resolve. Beachy doesn't end there. He doesn't end with these as our options. He ends instead here. Any minute, the alarm will go off. I'll lie here for a moment in the quiet of my room. It will seem for that moment like I'm crossing between worlds, asleep or awake, the past or the future, the living or the dead. But then I'll get up. The wind will blow the door open with a bang. The stars may be visible out there. I'll travel through the blue moonlight or the hushed severe dark if there is no moon. Maybe I'll take a journey. I remember the first time I saw the Milky Way. The stars are still a mild thrill if I don't overdo it. If I ration my experience of them, I'll go out in the cold and commune with their icy light. I'm waiting for the very darkest part of the night. My breath will warm my cupped hands. Not quite yet. So rather than accepting fate as one of these flower metaphors, he gives us something else. But then I'll get up. To get up in the middle of the night and go wandering. To go look at the stars and see the Milky Way and understand that it's not some great transcendent thing, but a created thing that I can now enjoy. The hope that Beachy ends with, then, is not about escape into some sort of disembodied afterlife. It's not to disregard that essential specter as something that can continue to haunt me. Rather, it's to hope for a resurrection. And the resurrection that we hope for here is deeply embodied. It's about waking up. It's about going outside. It's about looking at the world. It's about touching and about feeling. It's about the resurrection of this very body. As much as this book wants to work against Christian sensibilities, as much as it does work against Christian sensibilities, what it ultimately does is revive this idea essential to Christian faith, the resurrection of the dead. An idea so central to Christian faith, it's what marks our entire calendar year. For us, it's not about Christmas, it's about Easter. It's about the time of resurrection, about the time when death is triumphed over, about the time when God finally proves that he has been just all along and he's developed a solution for the problem of death. I would suggest what this book is doing at the end here is teaching us a way to engage with that essential specter of trauma, and the way to engage with that is hope for resurrection, hope for justice, and hope for resolution.